my distinct honor and privilege to get to introduce our special guest for the day, who needs no introduction. If you signed up for the session, you know who she is. But it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about Whitney Johnson. She's the CEO of Disruption Advisors, which is a tech-enabled talent development company and one of Inc.'s 5,000 fastest growing private companies in America. She's also the Wall Street Journal's best-selling author of Smart Growth and a top 10 business thinker, according to Thinkers 50. She's a former award-winning equity analyst on Wall Street and co-founder of the Disruptive Innovation Fund with the acclaimed Harvard Business School professor, Clayton Christensen. She's the host of the popular Disrupt Yourself podcast, and she's also married with 2 children and lives in Lexington, Virginia, where they grow raspberries, blackberries, and strawberries. My understanding is that she was also on a whirlwind tour of Europe. So it's awesome to get to welcome Whitney back to the States and back to the stage. With that, welcome, Whitney. We're delighted to get to learn from you today.
Thank you, Jeremy. I am very happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you see what I want you to see?
Bright and shiny.
Wonderful. Well, I am delighted to be here, and it's especially fun for me to join you because I actually grew up in Almaden Valley, which is not too far south of Stanford, and have very happy memories of going to Stanford football games as a child. So very fun to be with you today. What I'd like to do is, as Jeremy talked about this idea of a learning journey, I want to take you on a journey today and to really have you consider what you're learning and what your growth looks like. And to do that, I want to start by posing the following question, which is, do you believe that in order to transform your organization, in order to transform your team, you need to transform yourself? I want you to really consider that for a minute. Do you believe that to transform your organization, you need to also transform yourself? Well, this is a question that Egon Zehnder asked about 1,000 CEOs. And their answer was, prior to the pandemic, so about 2.5 years ago, only 38%, only 28% of these CEOs believed that they needed to transform themselves in order to transform the organization. But what's fascinating is that over the past 2 years, when they re-administered this survey, the respondents changed their mind. They now believed 80% of them strongly agreed that in order to transform the organization, they needed to transform themselves. And so over the past 2.5 years, that number has tripled. And there's this belief that you need to grow yourself in order to grow your people, in order to grow your company. So that belief is there. And I think that's in part because of the pandemic. Psychologists call a period of severe stress. After that period, like a pandemic, they say it leads to post-traumatic growth. And so I think that probably leads to this notion of I need to grow myself, to grow my people, to grow my company. And you probably believe that as well. That's why you're here today. But there are some obstacles. And the obstacles are these very thick neural pathways that we have in our brains, this comfortable routine, a super highway of habits. And when you think about doing something new, when you think about learning, when you think about growing, it's more like a cow path in your brain. And so one of the things that can happen is that when you attend a webinar like this Masters of Creativity, once the webinar is over, if not before, your brain says something like, this was interesting. It was nice to have a bit of a break from the day-to-day. That cow path is very cute, but it is time for us to get back on the road. You don't have time to grow yourself, let alone your people. And so the risk is, after sitting through something like this that you find informative, is that nothing changes. Well, it can. Of course it can. You obviously are all familiar with growth mindset because of Carol Dweck. But in order for something to change, you have to change. And you also understand that what got you here to this point in time, to this level of success, is not going to get you there. So you know you want to grow, you know you need to grow, you know what got you here won't get you there, but you also know that you don't want to walk in circles, which, by the way, is a real thing. The Max Planck Institute, they did a study. They took people into a forest and they said, we want you to walk in a straight line. And they didn't give them any landmarks. They just needed to rely on their sense of direction. Well, how do you think they did? Were they able to walk in a straight line? They all thought that they did pretty well. But when the data came back, when they looked at the GPS data, they found that they actually walked in circles. They walked in loops as tight as 20 meters. So here you are, post-traumatic growth. You are ready to grow yourself, to grow your people, to grow your company. It's going to help if you understand what growth looks like. Because when you understand what growth looks like, when you have a map, when you can get smart about growth, you're going to increase your capacity to grow. And so what I want to do now is introduce you to a map. And some of you are going to be familiar with this map. It's called the S-curve of learning. Well, you're familiar with the S-curve. So the S-curve, popularized by Everett Rogers, the sociologist, back in the 1960s. He used it to figure out how groups changed over time. We used it at our Disruptive Innovation Fund that I co-founded with Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School to figure out how quickly an innovation would be adopted. But as we were investing, I had this insight, this aha, that we could also use the S-curve to understand how individuals change, how we learn, and how we grow. And when you think of it through that lens, through that prism of looking at how individuals change, it starts to answer a number of questions. And those questions include, why is it so hard to start something new? Then it answers the question of why, once you do start, does it become relatively easy to keep going? And why, once you're really good at something, do you outgrow things so quickly? So these are some of the questions that the S-curve can answer. And what I want to do now is explain to you what is going on in your brain. Why does it answer these questions? Well, your brain, it runs these predictive models. And whenever you start something new, you have this hypothesis about what is it going to take for me to be successful? What's it going to take for me to get from the bottom of this curve, the bottom of the mountain, to the top of the mountain? And so at the launch point of that S-curve, what's going on with the predictive model is it's running lots and lots of predictions, or making lots and lots of predictions, many of which are inaccurate. And because those predictions are inaccurate, a number of things are happening. First of all, your dopamine is dropping. And dopamine, which is the chemical messenger of delight, you're basically de-delighting. It does not feel good. It is not enjoyable to have your dopamine drop. The second thing that's happening is that you're mapping new territory. You haven't seen this before. Your brain is literally making memories. And because it's so cognitively and physically, it's taxing, you can feel very exhausted and overwhelmed. And wow, this is really difficult. And the third thing that's happening is that you're no longer who you were, but you're not yet who you're going to be. And so your identity is in flux. And so the experience that you have at the launch point of the curve is that it feels overwhelming. It can feel discouraging. It can feel frustrating. You can find yourself feeling impatient. And it's not that growth isn't happening. In fact, it is happening very rapidly. But because it's not yet apparent, the experience that you are having, this emotional experience that you're having, is that growth feels slow. And so this is why it's very difficult for you to start something new. Then what happens? Well, you continue to put in the effort, and then you move into the sweet spot. So what's happening in the sweet spot? Well, your brain is continuing to run this predictive model, and now the predictions are increasingly accurate. And so you're getting this spike in dopamine, and there are these emotional upside surprises as your brain is starting to rewire. And so you get this delight and more delight and more delight. And so it feels very exhilarating. You also are starting to map out the territory. You have this sense of this mountain that you're climbing. You're not yet there, but you have a greater sense of how you're going to get there. And it's the same with your identity. You're not yet who you'll be, but you're starting to feel that identity, that new identity forming. And so the experience that you're having in the sweet spot, that steep, sleek back of the curve, is growth not only is fast, it feels fast. So that's the second part of the curve. Then the third part is mastery. Well, what's happening in mastery? You figured things out. The model is pretty much complete. And so you're getting a little bit of dopamine, but not a lot. And because you've already mapped out the territory, there's nothing new to see here. You're feeling kind of time is going by pretty quickly. The identity, that transformation is complete. And so you are now, it's now become the status quo. It's no longer who you could be or might be, it's who you are. And so the experience that you're having here is that growth is in fact slow because there's not a lot of dopamine. And so a simple way for you to remember this is slow and then fast and slow is how you grow. Simple, visual, it allows you to trace the emotional arc of your growth, whether it's professional or personal. Any endeavor that you take on, you can use this to think about that process of growth and change that you're undertaking. So something I'd like you to consider is in your current role, where are you on the S curve? Are you at the launch point? Are you in the sweet spot? Are you in mastery? And if you want to put it in the chat, we'd love to hear. And Jeremy, I'm gonna surprise you a little bit, give you a little bit of a surprise and ask you the question. In your current role, where are you on the S curve as we're seeing what people have to say about where they are in their roles?
Oh, it's great. That's a great question. I feel what's interesting to me is I occupy multiple roles and I am at a different point on the S curve in different roles that I occupy.
Yep.
So as it pertains certain programs that we run at Stanford, I'm definitely at the top. I'm definitely at the slow part of that S curve. As it pertains Masters of Creativity, for example, I feel I'm right in the middle of the fast part because, you know, I've never run a web series before and this thing's kind of gotten away from me in some ways. I'm trying to catch up with it. So different responsibilities that I have, I feel like I'm in a different spot on the S curve for each responsibility almost.
Oh, good. Well, first of all, thank you for letting me surprise you with that question.
Always.
And you raised something that I hope most of you are kind of going to is this idea is that your career, your job, your life is actually a portfolio of S curves and that you can be on multiple S curves at any given time. The one thing that I would want you to consider is that if you look at the project management research and also look at neuroscience research, you probably can only manage 3 to 4 S curves at any given time. And so that helps you understand why when, you know, if you've just taken on a big new role at work, it may be a good idea to wait to become a parent and move to a new city, because that puts you on 3 launch points all at the same time. And you're looking at balancing out that portfolio. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what's the sort of optimal percentages of, you know, how many curves in the sweet spot versus at the launch point and in mastery. So I hope that you're all now thinking about this idea of, all right, so in my current role, where am I on the S curve? Am I at that launch point where growth feels slow, but it's actually fast? Am I in the sweet spot where growth is fast and feels fast? Or am I in mastery where growth is in fact slow? And it's time for me to figure out a way to re-engage my growth so that I can continue to grow writ large. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is take you through, well, once you know where you are, you presumably know what's next. And so let me talk about what you want to do depending on where you are. Okay, I'm trying to, oh, there we go. Depending on where you are on the S curve. And I'm going to think about this, or I want you to think about this, not only in terms of what this means for you, but also think about it, what it means in terms of managing a team or managing a group of people. And at the launch point, not surprisingly, as we just talked about, this place of where things feel slow, where you feel overwhelmed and discouraged and uncomfortable and gangly and awkward and maybe even like an imposter, what you need is support. And support can come in a lot of different ways. It can come in the way of you just get training. It can come in the form of people giving you feedback, because when you get feedback, someone's investing in you and saying, I want you to be successful. So I'm going to tell you what's working. I'm going to tell you what isn't working. It also can come in the form of words of encouragement. And that could be from other people, but it also can be to yourself. And so I want to just talk you through briefly something that I think can be very, very powerful for you when you're at the launch point of the curve. And to introduce that, I want to tell you a quick story. So this is Marcus Whitney, and when he was in college at the University of Virginia, not too far from where I live now, and he dropped out because he decided that he liked rap and weed more than going to school. So now he's about 24 years old. He's a college dropout. He's living in an efficiency motel. He has 2 children, and he's thinking, this is not the life that I planned for myself. And what am I going to do? Well, it turns out that when he was about 10 years old, his uncle Otis worked for IBM, and he'd given him this toy computer, and he'd learned how to program a little bit. And he thought, maybe I could become a computer programmer. So he's working 6 days a week as a server in a restaurant, 12 hours a day. And then at night, he starts to study how to become a programmer. But he says it was a real challenge for him because there wasn't a lot of evidence that he could become a programmer. And so he said something very important. And this goes to this idea of words of encouragement, either to yourself or from other people when you're at the launch point of the curve. Here's what he says. He says, it was more to it than hard work. My mindset was critical. There wasn't a lot of evidence around me that I could be successful. I had to create a mind state supportive of my endeavor. I didn't believe I was becoming a programmer. I believed I already was a programmer. I didn't believe I was becoming. I believed I already was. I don't believe I might be able to climb this S curve. I don't believe I might be able to be successful in this role. I believe I am successful. And then let me add in one more quote for you to think about. This is from Neville Goddard. He said, the drama of life is a psychological one, and the whole of it is written and produced by its assumptions. Your assumption guides all of your conscious and subconscious movements so inevitably that it actually dictates events. And so something I want you to think about when you're at that launch point and you're thinking, I'm not sure if I can do it, or the people who work for you are saying, I'm not sure I can do it. You need to not only believe, you don't necessarily need to believe right now that you can do it, but you need to believe that you can do it. And those small little shifts in your words of I'm becoming to I am is what can allow you to believe those words of encouragement that you will be able to move up that S curve. The other thing that I want you to just consider is the importance of valuing the experience. When you've got a person on your team who's at the launch point, they're not necessarily able to do the work yet. And you may have days where you think, oh, I'm not sure it was a good idea to bring this person on board. And it's not just recent college graduates. It might also be people who are brand new CEOs, and you think they don't know how to do this yet. That's because they're at the launch point of the curve. But if you can value the fact that they are inexperienced, value the fact that they have a fresh perspective, value the fact that they are an expert in not doing things the way you do them, that can really open the door to innovation. And as you may be familiar with David Epstein's work and range, there's a lot of great research around that, but really being able and willing to value, because it's easy to say, I do value, but then when someone says, have you thought about doing it like this? We think, oh, just go do your work. And on our insecure days, it's more like, oh, they're attacking me. Why do you do it like this? And so if we were willing to value that in experience, we're able to help people gain momentum off the launch point of the curve. So something I'd like you to consider now is who on your team is on the launch point of the curve, and what support do they need from you? So who on your team, maybe it's you, and what support do they need from you? All right, so shall I keep going, Jeremy, or do you have anything that you'd like to comment on quickly?
One thing that I would love to know more about is on this valuing inexperience in particular. I think it's a profoundly important point. And yet, as you just said, the tendency is to be annoyed or frustrated or irritated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips or practical suggestions for how do you operationalize, for lack of a better word, how do you implement the attitude of valuing inexperience? Because it's a great idea, but I wonder about how to do it in a tangible way.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so what I would say, 2 things. One is that you need to think through, okay, based on what my team is trying to get done right now, based on the size of our organization, based on the projects that we have on, are we in a position to actually even have anyone at the launch point? So I think that's the first question you have to ask yourself. But then once you've made that decision of, yeah, we actually need a fresh perspective. We need some people who, we're in the finance department and we want to pull some people into marketing, or we're in marketing, we want to pull some people into finance. I think the way that you operationalize it is by just being aware that this is happening. And I'll give you a very specific example. So we had someone on our team who was on the launch point of the curve, and we were having a meeting and we were brainstorming about something that we were going to do. And one of the brand new people, said, hey, what about this? And I said, and someone else on the team said, oh, no, that won't work. And then, but not even realizing what we had done or what we had said. But then the rest of the day, I noticed that this person was not contributing. And so later in the day, at the end of the meeting, I said, hey, I noticed that you weren't saying anything. And they basically said, well, I did say something and you basically shut me up and shut me down. And so when that happened, I said, oh, you're right, I did. Because I, in my mind, was assuming that there was no asymmetry of power. But of course there was, because this person was brand new on the team. And so what I did is the very next day is that I called it out and I said, hey, we have different perspectives. We have different people on the team because we want to hear what you have to say. We want the fact that you are inexperienced. And so basically, apologized and said, so we want to make sure we're hearing from each one of you, and then giving people an opportunity to weigh in and give their perspective. So that's a very simple, very tactical way that you can do that, is once you're aware of it, just making that space for people to contribute their opinions.
I like that. It's almost admitting the mistake of not valuing it is the first step to creating the space to value it. That's great.
Yeah. Absolutely. Great question. Thank you. Okay. So here we are, we're on the launch point, but now we're going to move into the sweet spot. And so what's happening in the sweet spot? Well, you are very competent. If you look at self-determination theory, you're feeling the sense of competence and relatedness and autonomy. You're going fast. It feels fast. You are fast. And so what you just saw is, if you're going fast, you need to focus. And when I say focus, I want you to think about this from a number of different angles. The first angle is that, as I said a few minutes ago, when someone is on a curve, they probably only can do 3 or 4 things competently at any given time. But as someone moves into the sweet spot, because they're so capable, the tendency for you as a manager is to say, oh, let's have Jeremy take this and that and the other thing on. And before you know it, you want them to take on 10 things. And so the focus is giving that person permission to say, hey, we've got these 10 things and that you'd like me to do. Here's what I think the priority is. What do you think? And I need to say no to a few of these things in order for me to be able to deliver on what we discussed. And so it's allowing and helping the people on your team to focus. The other thing that you want to do is really just focus on what's working. So some of you, all of you, I'm sure, remember Kobe Bryant, who died way too young. But that is not who I want you to focus on. I want you to focus on the person whose face you can't see. His name is Shane Battier. There are lots of shots of the back of his head. And Michael Lewis, who wrote The Blind Side, called him the no stats all-star because no one actually knew what he did when he was on the court, except that the stats said that when he is on the court, or was on the court, his opponents like Kobe got worse and his teammates got better. And so they called him Lego, because things seem to magically work. Now, when you've got people in the sweet spot, because things are magically working, we tend to not be aware that they're working. And so in the sweet spot, you want to notice what is working, what's working. And then when you see what's working, you want to see who's making that work. Those are likely people who are in the sweet spot because they know enough to be productive, but they don't know so much they're starting to get somewhat bored. And as you focus on what's working, from brain science, you're going to get more of what you focus on. And then the final thing is just to make sure you're focusing on those people in the sweet spot by saying thank you and appreciating the good work that they are doing. Because this is that place where if they are doing really good work, they become a risk to go somewhere else. And so if you can focus on the work that you're doing, then that becomes that becomes a retention strategy. So what I'd like you to do now is consider.
Can I
Yes,
ask, Whitney,
please.
just because you said
Please.
something kind of as an aside that I think is very interesting and important. You said, based on cognitive science, you're going to get more of what you're focusing on.
Mhm.
I'd love just to double click on that for a second. What do you mean by that?
And I would love to talk more about it because I think it's so powerful. So what I mean is that our brains have this filtering mechanism. And so it filters for what we're looking for and filters for what we're not looking for. So like if you've just purchased a red car, you see lots of red cars. I remember when I was pregnant with my children, everybody was pregnant. Well, not everybody was pregnant. It's just that my brain knew to filter for that. And so when you tell your brain to pay attention to something, and especially when it's something visual, then it starts to focus on and look for things that will make that happen. So we go back to the Marcus Whitney example. He decided he was a programmer. Your brain does not your brain, but your subconscious doesn't know the difference between a truth and a lie. But if I am a programmer, then I'm going to look for data. I'm going to look for evidence. I'm going to look for tools that are going to reinforce that I am a programmer. And so when you focus on what's working, so for example, a very simple one is people will say things like, I want to get out of debt. But when you talk about being in debt, you will stay in debt. What you want to say is, I am building wealth. I am wealthy. And then what happens is your brain says, I am wealthy. So it looks for data. It looks for opportunities. It looks for ways to reinforce that mental image that you have of yourself. And so you're basically telling your brain's filtering mechanism to filter for the information that you want and to defilter or filter out the information that you don't want. So that's how you can use it. And because from an image standpoint, they're so much more powerful. It bypasses your executive functioning, goes straight to your subconscious. That's going to allow you to make that even more robust from a filtering perspective. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think it explains a lot about how we get what we expect.
Mm-hmm.
And if we expect good, good comes. If we expect bad or underperformance, then we end up finding that as well.
Right.
So it's really a warning against assumptions. But anyway, that's really interesting. I had never heard it put that way. You're going to get what you're focusing on.
Yeah, it's so powerful, and that's why people will talk about being grateful, and you'll say, you should be grateful. Well, yeah, grateful is good, but this goes to this idea of whatever you're focusing on, you're grateful for these three things. You're grateful for all the mentors in your life. You're grateful for all the people who have made it possible for you to be where you are. Guess what? There are going to be more people who are going to make it possible for you to be where you are because you're looking for it, you're grateful for it, and people will want to help you accomplish and move up that S curve. So that's the thing that you want to do is focus on what you want on the positive, and so that your brain will know to select for that. And that's part of the reason why the S curve becomes very powerful for you, because it is so simple, it's so visual, it gives you this map for you to be thinking about your growth. Okay, so who's in the sweet spot on your team? Maybe it's you, and how will you help them continue to grow? So, okay, get my cursor. Okay, so watching our time, we're still in good shape. Let's now go to mastery. So what's going on in mastery? Mastery, your brain is saying, kind of figured it out. I'm at the top of the mountain and there's not a lot of dopamine, and your brain is just saying, I need dopamine. I need a challenge. And that is why if you get to the top of a mountain and you don't do something, you don't find a way to keep climbing, you don't find a new S curve, you can start to self-sabotage because your brain needs something new. And so if you're managing yourself or other people, what you want to do is give them a challenge. And let me give you a very specific example of what that can look like. So one of our clients is Kraft Heinz, and they are very focused on learning. And one of the people, rising stars in this company, is a woman by the name of Yang Zhu, or Shu, probably pronounced more correctly. And what they found is that she was at the top of her S curve in treasury. And they actually needed her to stay in that curve. They needed her in that role, but they wanted to make sure that they could retain her. Building on this idea of a portfolio of S curves, they said, all right, she's at the top of her curve there, but how can we give her a curve where she's at the launch point? And so Treasury is a very external facing role. They gave her a COO type role as well, where she was at the launch point, which was internal facing, moved her from Chicago to Amsterdam so that now her portfolio allowed her to be in the sweet spot overall. And so it gave them a way to give her a challenge, but still accomplish the business purposes that they were, or the business objectives that they had. One other quick way for you to think about this, and this is a company that you're more familiar with because it's Google, which is a fellow by the name of Patrick Pichette, who was the CFO of Google. And when he first interviewed for the job, he found that he'd been a COO before, he'd been in operations before. And so Eric Schmidt, who was then the chairman, said, I think we've got a problem. You're going to be here for a few months and you're going to figure it out, and then you're going to be ready to do something new. So what I want you to do, Patrick, is every time you feel like you're at the top of the curve, he didn't use that language, that's mine, but when you feel like you're starting to get bored, I want you to come to me and let's figure out what you're going to do next. And it was that process of understanding where he was in his growth that every sort of year and a half, he went from doing just finance to people to real estate to Google Fiber, et cetera, and allowed him to stay in that same role for about 7 years because they continued to challenge him. So continuing on with the mountaineering theme, if you've ever climbed a mountain, you know that any altitude above 26,000 feet, I'm not sure what it is in meters, is known as the death zone. You're so high up, your brain and your body will start to die. Well, the same is true when you have a person who is at the top of their S curve. Because they're no longer learning, they're no longer building new neural pathways, their brain and body will literally start to die. And so what they need is a challenge, because learning is the oxygen of human growth. So I'd like you to consider now, who do you know on your team, maybe it's you, that's in mastery, and is it time for them to take on an additional challenge? All right, so what I'd like to do now is give you an opportunity to go into breakout groups and discuss what you are finding useful so far. What are you curious about? And Jeremy, why don't we just do this for about 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and just see if we have 1 or 2 comments that people want to share.
All right, Whitney, I think everybody's back from their breakout.
Wonderful. Okay, so what we'd love to have you do is, if you want to share in the chat section what you heard that you thought was interesting. It might not be what you are finding useful, but if you found one of your colleagues in your cohort, just share that in the chat. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you, what have you found useful so far?
Yeah, I think, we are big advocates at the D.school of the idea of a portfolio. So when you said portfolio of S curves, that really resonated for a number of reasons, because we believe in a portfolio of, in early stage front end innovation, having a portfolio of problem statements. And then for every problem statement, having a portfolio of ideas. And certainly ideas, but even solutions, bringing forward a portfolio of solutions in order to choose which one to deploy, et cetera. And so to Ronan's point here, I thought it was interesting, this idea that we can only manage 3 or 4 S curves, because I realize the constraints of the time-space continuum in which I find myself, living, but that I want lots of S curves, right? And so I thought it was interesting to think about, it's a finite resource, about the number of S curves one can occupy, both for myself. I also think about for innovation teams. And then lastly, just made me think about, management and recruitment, because what's interesting is you mentioned that S curves aren't just professional S curves, moving to a new city, having a child. And so it's an interesting thing to consider. What are the various S curves a potential recruit, for example, or a team member is occupying, and how do I factor that into work responsibilities that we might give them or something like that? How much do we consider it? And is that fair or unfair to say, oh, you're growing your family right now, probably not the right time to start a project. By the way, having 4 kids, I've constantly been in growing family mode for the last 10 years, right? So it's just, which is to say, I'm the, first target of that kind of question. So yeah, to me, there are implications both on the innovation front, but then also on the personal management front that
so good. Yeah. And it's interesting too, what Jessica said here is talking about different cultural norms surrounding professional growth and development in the UK and US. Yeah. So, and there are going to be differences culturally, there's going to be differences based on gender. For example, one of the things that you'll see is that because women are judged on track record versus potential, you'll oftentimes find women at the launch point are more qualified than men might be, because they had to have the track record that allowed them to get that role in the first place. Whereas a man, you might be more willing to say, yep, we'll give you an opportunity to have that potential. So just keeping those things in mind, there's a lot that you can consider as you're figuring out where people are on the curve and developing them. Okay, so what I'd like to do, see, Fernando, you said day-to-day S curves, that's right, versus long-term S curves. Yeah, so your day can be an S curve, and your life is obviously an S curve. And this is something that you can do as an activity on your team, is ask people, tell us about a formative curve that you've been on, and what did the launch point feel like, and what did the sweet spot feel like, and what did mastery feel like? So thank you for your thoughts here. And then Charlotte said how to onboard a new member of the team. That's right. Okay, good. So given that we've got about 10 minutes left, I'm going to continue. Just recapping quickly, what you can use the S curve for is it helps you demystify the process of personal growth, of thinking about the emotional arc of growth. It helps you think about decoding talent development, as a number of you have listed here in the comments, of thinking about where do I develop people, how do I develop them depending on where they are, how do I help them build momentum along the curve. It can facilitate recruiting. If you know that someone's at the mastery on a curve and you want to hire them, say, yeah, I need you to be on mastery for a brief time, but then I'll give you an opportunity to move to the launch point. And then it obviously improves retention, because what we see in our S curve insight tool and platform is that when people are in the sweet spot, you're good. But if you get someone who starts to tip into mastery and you're having indicators that they're feeling bored or demotivated, you probably have already lost them, because they've already psychologically made that decision to jump to a new curve somewhere else. But if you can track where they are in their growth, then when they're in the sweet spot, you can start thinking about already, what are we going to do once you move into mastery to make sure that you continue to be challenged? Because, well, if they're not a high performer, then you're okay if they leave. But if you want to retain them, you want to have that conversation earlier on. Okay, so we've addressed this idea of a portfolio of S curves. I touched on this very briefly. You want to use the standard S curve, or excuse me, standard bell curve distribution to think about how you're going to balance that out, whether it's your portfolio of curves. You want to have about 60% that are in the sweet spot, because that's that place where you're going fast and it feels fast and you're competent, you're exhilarated, you're engaged, but you're not yet sort of, I did what I came to do. You're not to that point yet. And so, you've got this innovation because you know enough, but not too much. You want no more than 20%, because there's a lot of work to support people so that they can move into the sweet spot. And yet you need people who have that perspective, because they're the ones who are helping you think differently and approach things differently. And then no more than 20% in mastery, because you're going to have people that are going to then need to do something else. You need the institutional memory, but you don't want to all of a sudden have this cliff where you've lost all of the institutional knowledge that you need for your organization. All right, so let me just give you a quick, actually, you know what? I'm going to just tell you, if you want to talk more about this, a great example of applying this is a company called Chatbooks. They brought us in. They had a number of people who had been there for 7 years. It's a great culture. People like to work there. They said, hey, can you administer your tool? which we did. We found out that most of their people were in mastery, but now we were able to have a conversation. We had this tool, we had this artifact for saying, okay, so you're in mastery. What do we want to do? And in one instance, it meant they went to a role outside of the firm. Another instance, there was a rescoping of responsibilities. Another instance, they gave them more launch point responsibilities, but they now had a language to talk about, oh, I'm at the launch point. It's awkward, uncomfortable. Yep, that's right. That's exactly how it's supposed to feel. All right. So the final thought that I want to give to you before we go into wrap up is this idea of the ecosystem. So you're climbing this mountain. You've got these tools that you need in order to climb the mountain, but you also want to think about not only what are the weather patterns looking like for you and your growth, but you yourself are creating the ecosystem for people around you. How are you making it possible for the people around you to climb the S curve? And Tom Rath, who StrengthsFinder, said contribution is the sum of what grows when you are gone. So something you can consider is where are your team members and or colleagues on the S curve, and what are you going to do to help them grow? Now, we've got about 5 minutes left before I turn it back over to Jeremy. I want to just go back to this idea of 3 things to remember as you're coming off the launch point of this conversation that we're having and moving from a cow path, or letting that cow path actually have a shot at turning into a superhighway. First thing I want you to remember is slow, fast, slow is how you grow. So when you're at the launch point, it's going to feel uncomfortable and gangly and awkward. Situation normal. This is how it's supposed to feel. The second thing I want you to think about is this idea. This is based on James Clear's work. We had him on the podcast, is the importance of setting ridiculously small goals. Something that's so simple, so small that you can absolutely do it, even if it were 11 o'clock at night. And I'm going to go through this really fast. Here's some things you can do. You can plot where your team member is. Each team member is on the curve. You can provide encouragement to launch pointers, write a text of appreciation to a sweet spotter, talk to a master about a new challenge, start a conversation about a new curve, or you perhaps can talk to your manager or team about where you are on the S curve. Or it may be something else entirely where you decided, I need to start exercising. Well, ridiculously small goal would be every day for the next week, I'm going to put on tennis shoes, because you're not exercising at all right now. So slow, fast, slow, supposed to be slow at the launch point, ridiculously small goals. And then the third thing is to say what you'll do by when to someone. So if you're thinking, oh yeah, there's this thing I'm going to do, 10% chance you'll do it. If you consciously decide you're going to do it, 25% chance, better odds. If you decide by when you'll do it, 40%. And if you commit to someone, so someone that's on this call today, yep, I'm going to do it by when, or commit to do it. But here's where you get the 95%. You're going to say what you're going to do to someone by when. So for example, I am going to plot where every person is on my team on the S curve. I'm going to tell Fernando that I'm going to do it by next Monday. 95% chance that it will happen. All right, and then this is a bit cheeky, but I love it anyway. My editor's husband's former boss says, if you want to be a star, do what you'll say you do, because almost no one does. So here's your quick recap. What I'd love for you to do is put in the chat very quickly Jeremy says, yeah, big fans of James Clear. Yeah, he's fantastic. So what's your ridiculously small S-curve goal? I'd love to hear you share this in the chat. I'm going to take like 30 seconds to review it. And then I'm going to make some final comments before I turn it back over to Jeremy. So anybody want to share? Yep, husband's editor's former boss, like I said, very cheeky. Let's see. Contribution is some of what grows when you're gone. Yep, so good, from Tom Rath. He's a very wise man. I love him. Okay, Ronan, complete the last chapter of your book. Okay, so that does not sound ridiculously small.
Ronan, come on, unless you only have like a sentence left.
Yeah, so Ronan, what I would love for you to do, so ridiculously small looks more like, I'm going to write for 5 minutes a day for the next week, and I'm going to tell, I'm going to tell Donna that I'm going to do it. Which, by the way, while you're doing that, while you're filling this in, I'm going to answer Donna's question. what I would do on this question of what if you want to say I'm employable, I would go back to what Marcus Whitney did, which is I am a programmer. So I am a program manager. I am a controller. I am a finance executive. I am a chief marketing officer. And so that your brain says, well, what does a chief marketing officer do? Whatever that is. And so that your subconscious acts and behaves that way, so that when you go into an interview, you act as if you already are that person, and they will pick up on it, and you will have people say, oh yeah, this person knows what they're doing. I want to hire them. I want to talk to them. Okay, we've got 6 new messages and I'll make my final comments. Let's see, what do we have? My mouse is acting up. Jeremy, what are they?
Miriam said she's going to do 10 minutes of yoga every day.
Okay.
Fernando said he's going to put workout on his calendar because he's someone who works out 5 times a week.
Okay, love it.
Sandra said she's going to change her workspace daily.
Okay. All right. And Jessica's going to reach out to boss about S-curve. Okay. Oh, Chris, you're starting a new job. Good. So that's what you do just all day long, Chris. You're going to just be like, launch point of the S-curve. I'm really uncomfortable. And then you'll be able to talk yourself through it. I do it all the time. So I hope this is helpful. Yeah, good luck to you. That's very exciting. And then,
I love Charlotte's make 1 new connection daily until the end of the month. That's
wow. Okay. I don't know if that's ridiculously small, but maybe you usually make 5. But yeah, whatever. So when you're thinking ridiculously small, here's what I want you to think. What is it so small that if it were 11 o'clock at night, and you're about to get in bed and you're really tired, you would say, oh, I forgot to make a connection. You would still do it. That's what ridiculously small looks like. So use that. Okay. Okay. 30 minutes every day, Ganesh. Whoa. Can you put it down to like 5 minutes? Make it really small. Because what you're doing, I forgot to tell you this is a dopamine hack. Because remember, you want to get dopamine. You don't have a lot of dopamine at the launch point. You get a lot in the sweet spot. So make it so small that you can beat it, because then that gives you dopamine. And then when you get dopamine, then you start to build momentum that tips you into the sweet spot. So with that, I am going to make some final comments. We talked a lot. The world has talked a lot about the Great Resignation. And what I would say to you, I would submit to you that that is in fact a misnomer. What we have discovered, as I talked earlier about post-traumatic growth, we have revisited and reevaluated our lives. And we discovered through the pandemic that we were far more capable, more competent, more resilient than we had ever supposed. And so as we're looking at this next stage of the world, next stage of our lives, we're not resigning from, we're not quitting. What I think is happening is we're aspiring to. And so I would encourage you to think of this as the great aspiration. One final story I want to share with you is this. When I was working on Wall Street, I had just built my financial model. I was an equity analyst, and I needed to decide if a stock was a buy or a sell. And stock company was great. Valuation looked reasonable, but the stock was up a lot. And so I did not want to put a buy on the stock. So I went to my boss and I said, hey, how about if I put a neutral, which basically isn't a recommendation. It's like, don't buy it, don't sell it. And so I had one colleague call me a shrinking violet, which I totally own. But then my boss said more gently, well, why wouldn't it keep going up? Happily put a buy on the stock. Happily, the stock did go up. But that question of why wouldn't it keep going up has stayed with me. And so 20 years later, I have wondered, okay, do I believe that the stock could keep going up? But more importantly, do I believe that people can keep going up? Do I believe that we can continue to grow? And the answer is a pound the table definitive yes. Growth is our default setting. Human growth is unbounded. The S-curve of learning can help us get smart about our growth, have a map. But most importantly, and I will leave you with this, is that the more we grow, the more we can grow.